Hello, my name is Shira Klein. I'm Associate Professor of History at Chapman University, which is in Orange County, California. In this 35-minute video, I'll talk about a cultural effect the COVID-19 virus has had, and that is an alarming rise in anti-Semitism. I'll do this by looking at some racist images that have been circulating recently, and I'll explain the historical origins of these tropes. Towards the end, I'll also look at another kind of racism that has spiked recently, anti-Chinese prejudice.
So let's begin. Let's juxtapose a current image with a historical one. To the right is a meme circulating in social media. At the top panel is Uncle Sam saying, "Oh God, what a crisis, how can I respond to this?" And he's looking at a stereotypical representation of a Chinese man, and I'll get more to that later on. And then as the virus gets worse, we move to the bottom panel in which he is presenting a fat check to someone meant to represent the Jews. And there are two stereotypes that you can see over here represented in this Jewish man who's accepting the check. One is the obsession with money or greed, and the check is made out to Jewish finance. And the other is the physical differentness of this Jewish man. He has a larger nose than the other characters here, and he seems to be darker or and hairier as well. Now, both of these stereotypes, the obsession with money or greed and the physical differentness, both stemmed from the Middle Ages. And now if you look at the image to the left, and particularly at the characters in that image that are marked by the white arrows, which I added, those two are meant to represent Jews, the far left character and the far right character. And note what they're doing. One of them is handling coins, and the other is holding something, which is in fact a money bag. Now, why were Jews associated with money as early as the Middle Ages? And that had to do with the fact that they worked in money lending, or some Jews, a minority of Jews, worked in money lending. Why did they do that in the first place? Because Jews were forbidden from working in agriculture, and they couldn't join the guilds. The guilds were professional associations which handled most branches of manufacture. For instance, metalworking or shoemaking. And the guilds, for reasons of hostility towards Jews, forbade Jews from joining their groups. So there were very few professions that Jews could do. Some of them worked in trade, and some of them worked in money lending. And the reason that they were excluded in the first place from these other professions had to do with their status under Western Christendom. They were the only non-Christian minority, unlike in other places in the world at the time where there were several minorities and that led to more tolerance. But under Western Christendom, they were the only non-Christian minority, and they were accused of deicide, which is the killing of Christ, the idea that all Jews were to blame for this original sin of the killing of Christ. Because Jews were excluded from most jobs, they turned to trade, and a minority turned to money lending. Money lending meant that they would lend money and collect it at interest. Think of money lending as a precursor to today's banks. It's an important sector, just as banks are important, and it enabled economic growth. But people didn't really like returning loans with interest, so that generated hostility towards Jews. And people began to speak more and more about Jews as usurers, meaning as individuals who collected exorbitant rates of interest. In fact, we know from historical research that most Jewish moneylenders in most places charge very modest interest rates, to the point that the lay and Christian leaders saw Jewish moneylenders as a good way of handling their people's very poorest stratum, because they would lend at such low rates. But in the Christian imagination, the idea began that Jews were obsessed with money, or greedy, or stingy, or avaricious, or usurers. And ironically, moneylending was both a result of anti-Jewish feeling and a cause of it, because it resulted from the fact that Jews were in the first place excluded from other professions, and it led to the fact that Jews were resented because they collected interest. Also in this image to the left, you see crooked noses. I'll zoom in a little bit and you can see this up close. You can see the figure on the far left and the figure on the far right have different noses. The origin of this is also medieval, and that's because the bad guys, quote unquote, were drawn in profile until the late 13th century. The nose in profile was a visible way for artists to highlight a cultural difference. And you can't really see it in this painting, but Jews in the Middle Ages also began to be associated with darker skin. This was a way of tying them to other non-believers, like Muslims in North Africa or in the Middle East, and these were groups whom Christians had met through the Crusades. Now, in reality, Jews didn't look much different, but because too much mixing had occurred for European Jews to actually have different physiognomic features by the Middle Ages. And in fact, if you look at paintings of Jews by Jews, you see them as having much the same noses and the same skin tone as other people from the era are depicted. But the trope of Jews as looking different was a powerful stereotype, and it stuck for centuries, as we see with the cartoon that has emerged recently. Here's another image triggered by the pandemic, the cartoon on the right. And that image, as many others triggered by the pandemic, keep returning to money and to physiognomy. Money, in that this man has a sign next to him saying get your coronavirus shot, suggesting that Jews are going to make a lot of money off the vaccine, either by developing it or by administering it. He's clutching a syringe, just to clarify that that's how he's planning to make his money. He has a large nose, again, physical differentness. Note the hunched shoulders. This is another common trope, suggesting perhaps that Jews are less healthy, or that they're hunched either over their Torah scrolls, their religious texts, or perhaps over finance books all day long, so their shoulders are hunched. And he has a head covering as well, just in case you weren't sure he was Jewish. That is the kippah. And then his hands are clasped in this sort of cunning planning pose, again telling us that he's planning to do no good, to profit from this virus. Again, if you look at the two images on the left, these are medieval images. And the one on the far right shows Jews as worshiping the devil. The devil here is seen as a goat with horns. And what I'd like you to note about this is that the foremost figure that you can see wearing green clothing and a red cape is holding something sort of elliptic, and that is a money bag. So by the late Middle Ages, the association of Jews, money, and devilry had been firmly established. If you look at this next image over here, also from the Middle Ages, you see another association. Money isn't in here, but what is here is, again, this association of Jews with the devil, and note that the devil is darker skinned. So an association of Jews being sort of in cahoots with a darker figure, and again, that figure resembling something evil. Now, this is not yet biological racism. In the Middle Ages, there was no biological understanding yet of the difference between dark skin and light skin. But it certainly is pairing Jews and other non-believers, as far as the Christians were concerned, with negative traits. Here to the right, you see another image from recently, triggered by the pandemic. And what you see is, again, a similar figure. This is that sort of iconic representation of the Jewish man. He's not only got a head covering, a kippah, he's also got tefillin, which is something that Orthodox or some Jews use to pray with. Again, the large nose, again, the hunched shoulders, again, the cunning pose of clasped hands. And in case you didn't understand that it referred to the coronavirus, his whole figure is encased in what appears to be a close-up of the coronavirus particle. And then all around, there are mirror images of him inside that coronavirus. And the caption reads, "Stay home, stay safe, while we steal everything." So here, Jews are shown as stealing. The idea of greedy Jews, as I said, began in the Middle Ages, but gained new momentum in the 19th century with the rise of a new kind of economy, and that was the modern industrial economy. I'll take a look at the image on the left in just a minute and I'll zoom into it, but first I'd like to give you a little bit of context. Up to the 19th century, production had been mostly cottage industry, meaning people manufactured things at home with little surplus. With the development of technology, production became industrial, meaning people made things in factories with lots of surplus, and products became cheaper because of that. So there was mass production, mass consumption, and massive urbanization, or a huge move to towns and cities where the factories existed. There was the rise of new kinds of businesses like department stores or big businesses. And the European economy transformed, among other things, also in the birth of the modern banks and stock markets. Some Jews who already had experience with money because of their history as traders or as moneylenders, and because they were already urban and towns and cities were where this new economy was developing, some Jews became bankers. And now let's zoom into this picture and see what anxieties this generated. So in this mid-19th century image of anti-Jewish propaganda, you see a group of bankers, all of who are meant to be understood as Jews. They all have the large nose. They all have sort of hairy facial features. They all have malevolent expressions. And they are all portrayed as thieves. So there is a little boy who is attempting to steal something from one of the Jewish adults. And then the caption reads, "Herr Baron, that lad's stealing your handkerchief." And the other adult says, "Let him go. We once started small too." Meaning we're all thieves, so it's okay if this little child steals because we are also thieves and you have to start somewhere. So it's okay that he's starting very young. In other words, the fact that some Jews became bankers and other Jews joined this new economy in different ways, that generated anger and sometimes envy among other Europeans. And the result was that Europeans viewed this as wrongful and depicted Jews as thieves. So again, this idea of Jews stealing has a history. Here again, on the right, another image from the present day, you see Jews featuring as profiting from the suffering of others. Again, the old trope, the large nose, the hunched shoulders, the hands clasped in a cunning pose, the head covering, just in case you had any doubt that he was Jewish. And some of the captions say things like, "Buy my vaccine," or "Never let a crisis go to waste." So again, indicating that Jews are profiting or making a good buck off the suffering of others. And again, this notion has a history, especially going back to the late 19th century. So if you take a look at the cartoon on the left, I'll explain it and then I'll explain the context behind it. What you see is the man on the left, if I zoom in, the man on the left, we're meant to understand him as a Christian shopkeeper. He is light-haired, notice, and he's humble because he's got his hat in his hands. The man on the right, we're meant to understand as a wealthy Jewish department store owner, judging from the background. He has a gold chain in a time of crisis, and I'll talk in a minute about this decade that the image appears in. And again, he has a rather large nose. He is portrayed as being someone who we might think of as unattractive. And the caption reads the following. The man on the left is saying, "I've come to tell you that your infamous cutthroat competition has totally ruined me. There's nothing left for me to do but put a bullet through my head." And the Jewish man responds, "May I suggest the firearms department, which is on the first floor." In other words, there's a suggestion over here, or an accusation, that the Jewish-owned department store has put out of work this honest, hardworking, small shopkeeper. And not only that, but that this Jewish man is keen to profit off the distress and the suffering of the Christian shopkeeper, because he says, "Oh, you want to commit suicide? Okay, well, get a gun from me, and then I'll at least make some money off of that." Now, to explain this image, recall that industrial economy that I spoke about just one slide ago. And I'll say from the get-go that to the vast majority of Europeans, that economy meant improvement in the long run, because urbanization brought with it mass education, it brought improvement in medicine, more people became wealthier all over Europe, and so forth. But in the short run, there were depressions, particularly in the 1890s when this image is from. And during this time of crisis, some groups in society lost out. People like this small shopkeeper who couldn't compete with department stores, small farmers who suddenly found that there were machines to do the agricultural work, small manufacturers who suddenly found that there were factories that could sell products at a much cheaper price than they could. So there were various groups who were very anxious about industrialization and this shift to a new kind of economy. And in the non-Jewish mind, Jews became the cause of this change and the ones to blame for all of its wrongs. And that's because Jews benefited from industrialization, and they did benefit from industrialization. But in the minds of the Christians, there was this jump from Jews benefited to it to Jews were the cause of this new economic order. And therefore, Jews were to blame for all of its wrongs. Now, if you take Germany, where this cartoon is from, only the tiniest minority of Jews in Germany actually own department stores. And to begin with, Jews only made up 1% of the whole of German society. And most of them were in the lower middle classes. But this image gained power that Jews profited obscenely from the suffering of others, and that they stood to blame when things went wrong, as they did in this crisis of the 1890s. Now let's move on to another accusation that we see today, that Jews are taking over the world. If you look at the meme on the right that has been circulating again in social media the last couple of months, you see a Trojan horse. This is a classic reference from the Greek attack on Troy, when the Greeks had imposed a siege for 10 years that wasn't working. Troy just wouldn't give up. And then the Greeks built a massive wooden horse and left it outside the gates of Troy. And the Trojans let it in because they thought that the Greeks had left. But once the horse was inside, out jumped Greek soldiers who sacked the city, and that's how they destroyed Troy. So the Trojan horse itself represents a secret weapon that appears harmless, but will actually wreak destruction. And the head of the Trojan horse in this image is a coronavirus particle, and the engine inside the horse, or the kind of the parallel to the Greek soldiers who are about to destroy the city, are a Jewish man standing behind a globe. And that suggests the idea, which is a common anti-Semitic trope, that Jews are about to take over the world. Or in the case of the pandemic, they're going to use the coronavirus to destroy the world or to take over the world. And up here on the right, you see a mirror image of this Jewish man, again in the usual pose of the clasped hands and the hunched shoulders and the big nose. Now, this particular accusation of Jews taking over the world started in the late 19th century. And it started with the rise of nationalism. So again, just a tiny bit of context. Prior to the 19th century, countries didn't have a huge sense of national pride or national specificity. Many states, as we know them today, didn't even exist in the 19th century, or up until the late 19th century, like Germany or Italy. They were just a few isolated states and that were not tied together. And then others like France were officially states, but in fact they were composed of regions which each had a different language or dialect, each had a different measuring system, each had a different system of governance. But in the 19th century, intellectuals and politicians began to whip up national fervor, began saying, you know, you're not just Tuscan or Venetian, you're Italian. Or you're not just Bavarian or Prussian, you're German. Or you're not just Parisian or Niçoise, you are French. And people came to think of themselves as a nation. And as they came to think of themselves as a nation, they began to be anxious about who wasn't part of their nation. So other nations threatened them, and also people who happened to live in their country, but who they felt were outsiders to their nation. And Jews were a primary target of that sort of nationalist fervor. And all tropes about Jews now came to include a new accusation that Jews were disloyal to their country and were going to take over the world. And that is the context for this image over here, where you can see, this is from late 19th century France, and you can see a man who is clutching the globe. He represents the Jews, and he's clutching the globe again in this accusation that Jews are loyal to no single country and they are going to take over the world with their international ties to one another. So the idea was that Jews couldn't be truly French, they couldn't be truly German, they couldn't be truly Italian. And these suspicions came to a head with the Dreyfus Affair. And this image is from the height of the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair in France was an affair that erupted when a Jewish officer in the French army named Alfred Dreyfus was wrongfully accused of spying on France for Germany. So he was a German, there was a German spy in France, and people thought that it was Alfred Dreyfus. Now later he was proven innocent, and the actual spy was caught, but this accusation triggered a spate of anti-Semitic propaganda showing Jews as the betrayers of the French nation and as loyal to no single country. And that's really where this image comes from. This was created by people who thought that Dreyfus was guilty. And you can see that the notion of Jews taking over the world is added onto the old anti-Semitism, because there are coins dripping from his persona, even as he's dressed in a sort of beggar's clothing, very shabby clothing, and that just adds to the deceit, because he looks poor, but he's actually dripping with money, and there are bills in his pocket. A final anti-Semitic trope, and this will be my last example for anti-Semitism, the final trope that we'll see today is how Jews feature as a biological parasite, or as the virus incarnate. Current propaganda, as you can see in this image on the right, says Jews are the virus. You can see the legs are sort of like the virus legs, and then the head of the virus are heads of these Jewish men. Again, if you had any doubt, they have a head covering. They even have a little Star of David, which is a symbol of the Jewish religion. And there is the large, the usual large nose and the cunning expression and so on and so forth. And then the caption says, COVID-19 viewed under a microscope, interesting. So this is really suggesting that Jews are the virus, that they are somehow a biological problem. And this also dates back to the late 19th century, and even more so to the right-wing movements of the 20s and 30s and 40s. And it stemmed from the rise of biological racism, a quasi-science that claimed that there was empirical evidence to show that races existed and there were superior races and inferior races. And the Nazis took this the furthest, believing that Jews were an actual biological parasite, a sort of type of non-human bent on destroying the other humans, and particularly the Aryan, quote unquote, Aryan race. And this poster to the left is an example of that. This is showing Jews as a biological parasite. It says Jews are lice, they cause typhus. So they are dehumanized, and they are the cause of disease. And I think in some ways the image to the right is even more dehumanizing than the Nazi images, which gives us some food for thought. Before I end, I'd like to speak very briefly about another kind of racism that this virus has triggered, and that is towards Asians. This is not really my field of expertise, but I do teach Asian American history to some extent. So I'd like to talk about some of the tropes that we've been seeing, particularly in the US, and to talk about their historical roots. Anti-Chinese rhetoric in the last 2 months has been far more widespread than anti-Jewish rhetoric. There are hundreds and hundreds of anti-Chinese images out there. The most popular form of virus-related xenophobia, meaning anti-Chinese or images that show a fear of Chinese or Asians more generally. So the most popular form of this is an invented figure called Corona-chan. And here are some examples, Chan being a common Chinese last name. So Corona-chan is the virus. Now, there are hundreds of renditions of this on the web, so different versions, but it is always a female figure. She's often hypersexualized, as this example, for instance. She's dressed in Chinese traditional dress, and she has other Asian identifiers. Over here, for example, she has a pair of chopsticks. The style of the comic is anime, which is Japanese animation, so that's another Asian identifier. Usually she has bat wings, like this one over here, this one over here as well. This one is even eating bat soup, and these are, this is a nod to the fact that bats are thought to be the original host of the virus. Sometimes she's holding a bottle of Corona, as in this image over here, and she seems to be drunk. And there's always some sort of connotation to the virus. So in this case, the sort of death queen, she's holding supposedly a bull or something like that, and it is in the shape of the coronavirus particle. Over here, her hair accessories, and over here too, her hair accessories are in the shape of the virus. And over here, she's eating soup out of a bowl that is in the shape of a virus. She's a femme fatale. She uses her sexuality as part of her deadliness, meaning she'll lure you and then she'll infect you. So it's not only anti-Chinese, it's also misogynistic. It's a portrayal of women's bodies as a weapon, which they can use to harm other people. And this too has a history. So if you look at these images, these are images 1, 2, and 4 showing anti-Chinese sentiment across time in this country. If you look at images 1 and 2, these are from the time these are from the 1880s and 1890s, around the time of the Exclusion Act. The Exclusion Act came out in 1882, and it said that Chinese could not immigrate to the United States. It was the only legislation in American history which targeted a group by name. This was a time of assaults, of arson, of murder. I live near Santa Ana in Southern California, and many people don't know this, but Santa Ana once used to have a Chinatown, and it was burnt to the ground in the early 20th century as part of this xenophobia. This was a time when Chinese received pejorative names like Chinaman or Chink. The Chinese in America couldn't become citizens, meaning they couldn't vote. So they experienced more discrimination than any other immigrant group in this period. And these images are from that time. If you take a look at the image from the left, image number 1, you see a Chinese man standing in the place of Lady Liberty on the Statue of Liberty. And there are beams coming out of his head. And they say, one of them says filth, one of them says immorality, one of them says diseases. So this notion that Chinese are destroying America, are taking over America, and that they are bringing all these horrible things to America, filth and disease. And this image is showing a Chinese man standing over a lying white woman, suggesting that he is about to or has already raped her. And note the sexual threat over here, just like with Corona-chan, but on the inverse. As Corona-chan is a Chinese woman who is going to seduce a white man, and over here we see a Chinese man who is raping a white woman. But in either way, this is a sort of really rabid xenophobia, very racist suggestion that the Chinese are a threat through their sexual practices. And the reason for this xenophobia in the late 19th century was primarily because white workers, and especially Irish workers, feared that the Chinese would take their jobs. So historians have looked at where this xenophobia primarily came from, and they found that Irish workers were very anxious about their wages, very anxious about their jobs, and they chose to direct their anxieties towards Chinese workers. Now, they could have focused on German workers or on Italian workers who oftentimes were in the same industries as they were. But Irish workers chose to focus on those who were different from them, those who had a very different language, right? The distance between Chinese and English is far greater than the distance between Italian or German and English. And between people, and they chose to focus on people who looked the most different from them. And again, the physiognomy is far different. And one of the things that it says in these beams that are coming out of the Statue of Liberty's head is ruin to white labor. So very clearly, this was the anxiety that dominated that time period. Now, if you look at image 3, you'll see that this is actually a rather positive portrayal of the Chinese. And it's no small wonder that this happened in 1941. This was a time when China temporarily became the ally of the United States. So we see a positive portrayal of Chinese. But then soon after, this is from the 50s, this is a time of the Cold War, and we see again a really gross dehumanization of a Chinese figure. He's called Yellow Claw, and he's being showed as this really demonic figure. This was in fact a comic series created by Marvel, and the figure in question was a sort of super villain. To sum up, the pandemic has brought out society's ugliest fears. And as in the past, so today, racism follows crisis. If you recall the 1890s depression that I mentioned in Germany, that led to a heightened racism towards Jews. The case that I just spoke about now, in the case of white workers' anxiety in, again, the 1880s and the 1890s, that brought about heightened racism towards the Chinese. And the virus today is bringing out anxieties in people and more racism. I think it's because people are looking for a scapegoat. They're looking for someone to blame, and they draw on a repository of already ingrained stereotypes. So that is a window into the virus's cultural impact and how it has replicated racist tropes from the past. This is my email in case you'd like to get in touch with any questions or comments. Thank you for listening.